Good morning. Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Seth. I'm one of the pastors here on staff today. I'm heading up to a new church here pretty soon, and honestly, I cannot even begin to tell you how much I love you, South Valley. It has been, thank you. It has been. Thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege to love with you, to hurt with you, to pursue Jesus with you, and to refuse to quit with you. You know, when I first came here, I had thought that ministry was over for me. I had been preaching frequently, and I was well on my way to becoming a senior pastor until I left the denomination that I was in, and realizing with that I was leaving behind everything, quite possibly including any career opportunities that I might have had. And so Katie and I, we had some plans to do some church shopping, and South Valley was the first church we landed at, and the only church that we landed at. We didn't end up going to see any other churches. This was it. This was where we stuck. And I remember that we used to sit actually right over here, and we found out that we sat not quite in the front row, close to the front row, but not in the front row because we're not psychopaths. Sorry, Cecil and Jennifer, but those front row people there's something else. But we sat just right over there, and we found out that we stole that seat from Tim Shook, and that's how we met Tim. And that's the same reason that we met the Shiveleys. It's the same reason that we met Melanie Thayer. It's the same reason that we met so many of you just because of where we decided to sit on a Sunday morning. And sincerely, it astounds me what happened in my life because you as a church allowed me and my family to simply come and sit in the presence of Jesus with you. You know, I had wanted so badly to become a senior pastor, and I knew for sure that I was giving all of that up. I never expected to be a pastor at South Valley. And I remember the first time that I walked onto this stage, it was in an empty room, and I was preparing to preach for the first time here, and I preached to hundreds of empty chairs. But I remember knowing that each of those chairs represented souls of people who God was going to bring here to hear him speak. Not me, but to hear him speak. And that was so overwhelming. It's still overwhelming. And I just want to say that I love you all so much. I'm so grateful for each one of you. I'm grateful that you're the church that God chose to use to sit me down. Because before coming here, I was so busy rushing to be a pastor that I think I missed the point. I missed the point of just being present with Jesus, being present with his people. And isn't that so like us, right? To just let hurry have its way in our lives and then look back and realize that we actually have no idea what it's stolen from us. And I think Jesus actually has a lot to say about this. And actually, maybe it's not so much that he's saying anything, but maybe it's more about what we can learn if we just focus in and watch the pace at which Jesus lived his life. If you've got your Bibles with you this morning, we're going to be in the book of Mark chapter 5. If not, we'll throw the passages up on the screen, but we'll be in Mark chapter 5. And to give some background to this, Jesus has been going around preaching, and he's been swarmed by these crowds. And as he's being swarmed by crowds, he gets on a boat, he sails across a lake, and he ends up meeting this guy that we just call the demoniac. This guy, he's demon-possessed. Jesus asks about the demon, and the demon says, "We are legion, for we are many." Like, that's weird, right? And Jesus casts the demons out. He tells this man to go back and to tell the people what he's done. He gets back on the boat, sails back to where the crowd originally was, and that's where we pick up. So we're going to be in Mark 5, starting in verse 21. It says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. You know, it wasn't until I was doing some studying on this passage that I realized most of the people with whom Jesus interacted are not named. Jairus, however, is named. Right? We're still technically in this holiday season, right? It's incredibly busy. Some of you just had family over for Christmas. Some of you just went and visited some family. And some of you had a kid come up to you during that time frame. They're like, "Mom, what's his name?" Right? And you're like, "That's your uncle. What are you talking about?" Right? Right? But we've learned that just because they see somebody once a year doesn't mean they know that person, right? It takes more than that to learn who somebody is. To truly know somebody takes the time of sitting down, speaking with them, listening to them, getting to hear their story. And there was something about Jairus, whether he was a leader in the synagogue or whether it was the fact that Jesus truly slowed down and identified this single man out of the crowd of people. Something caused the gospel authors to grasp his name and to write it down. Jesus was clearly present with this man. I mean, imagine this starts by telling us that these large crowds had gathered around Jesus while he was by the lake. What do you think a large crowd following Jesus does? They demand a miracle, right? They want to see a show. And as they're begging for miracles, what better miracle to ask for than the one that you need, right? Than the one that you want. And so all of these people are pressing in, and we can imagine they're all asking for their own miracle. And for those of you who are parents, I think that maybe there's some sort of idea around this, right? Like, you know that feeling when all the kids are like, "Mom, Mom, 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 Mom," right? And then your husband walks in and he's like, "Hey, what's for dinner?" Right? Like, I don't have to finish that story. You guys know. You know. And yet, in the midst of the chaos of the crowds, Jesus sees and hears this man. What stands out to me is that Jesus had time for this man's panic. Church, Jesus has time for panic. He has time for panic. As Jairus is living in a world where he's watching his daughter's life drain away from her, he's now throwing himself at the feet of Jesus, allowing for all of the panic to exit his body in the form of begging for a miracle, begging for Jesus to simply touch her so that she might be healed. You know, I've heard a lot in my life that when people are panicked, they're having anxiety or they're depressed or what have you, the others will say, "Oh, you just got to have more faith," right? And now, don't hear me wrong. More faith is never a bad thing. If you can have more faith, have more faith. But the reality is that the presence of Jesus is not contingent upon the amount of faith that you have to offer him. Church, the presence of Jesus is not contingent upon the amount of faith that you have to offer him. Listen, when I look at all the different religions that this world has to offer us, there is one thing in particular that stands out about Christianity. Jesus is willing to sit in the darkness with us. Jesus is willing to sit in the anxiety with us. He's willing to sit in the panic with us. He's willing to sit in the doubt with us. He has time for your anxiety. He has time for your panic. And I mean, in this passage, there are all these people surrounding Jesus who are certainly yelling out for their own miracle to be fulfilled. And while Jairus is at the end of his rope, hoping for anything that might stop his daughter from dying, Jesus is present with him. And that's actually an incredibly interesting part of this story, because notice that Jesus doesn't actually say anything to Jairus. He doesn't say anything to him, right? Whenever somebody comes to us and they've got a problem, right, we're thinking, like, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? Jesus doesn't say anything. It just says that he went with him. In the face of panic, Jesus had his presence to offer. He was present. Dallas Willard once said that hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life, and that we must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from our lives. Now, if you're like me, you're like, okay, Dallas, great. Clearly you don't live in our world, right? Like, you haven't seen how our lives are. You haven't seen what's demanded of us. But I love that a student of his, John Ortberg, in his book, Soul Keeping, he addresses the difference between busyness and hurry, and here's what he says. He says, busyness is a condition of the body when we have many things to do. Busyness is inevitable in our modern culture. If you're alive today in North America, you are a busy person. Being hurried is an inner condition, a condition of the soul. It means to be so preoccupied with myself and my life that I am unable to be fully present with God, with myself, and with other people. Busyness migrates to hurry when we allow it to squeeze God out of our lives. This, to me, seems to be the fundamental difference between how Jesus did ministry and how we so often do ministry today in the American church. Right? We actually allow the busyness of ministry to turn into hurry as it squeezes God out of our lives. We're so focused on simply accomplishing tasks that we miss out on being present in the moment. We want to help as many people as we can, so we turn those people into numbers and objects rather than seeing them as individuals who bear the image of the Creator God. So, church, Jesus has time for your panic. Jesus has time for your anxiety. Jesus has the time for your problems. Jesus' pace was one that allowed him to show and to give grace. And there was no room for hurry in him. And the story continues in verse 24. It says, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Now, let's talk about a few things that are going on here before we move on. Uncleanness is really important in Jewish culture. And the sort of bleeding that this woman would have been going through would have made her perpetually unclean. So what does that mean? It means she can't get married. It's likely a huge reason why she was already out of money. There was no way she could have any source of income without being married in this culture. It meant that she could not have any community. Everywhere she went, she had to cry out, unclean, so that everybody else knew to stay away from her. It meant that she could not have God, because as long as she was unclean, she was not welcomed in the temple. She was not welcomed with the people of God. Not until the bleeding stopped. This woman would have been a total outcast in society. The complete opposite of a leader in the synagogue like Jairus. And when Jairus came and he threw himself at the feet of Jesus, this woman, who is not named, sneaks up behind him. She has the faith that she can receive healing from him, but she doesn't want anybody to know that she's there. Look what it says in verse 30. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And the disciples said to him, You see the crowds pressing in around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. Now, I love the disciples' response, right? Like, what do you mean, who touched you, Jesus? Literally everyone, right? Now imagine for a moment what's going through Jairus' mind, right? Like, your daughter is dying, you're on your way, and Jesus suddenly stops and turns around and asks, who touched me? What does it matter, Jesus? My kid is dying. We have to hurry. But see, here's the key about Jesus. Jesus made time for interruptions. Jesus made time for interruptions. You guys ever worked with somebody with ADD? Like, I'm talking like bad ADD, right? I have this coworker here at South Valley. I won't name him, but he does stand on the stage here and sings, and he has a large beard. During the work week, I'll tell him something like, hey man, I need some help moving a ladder or something. Can you help me move it? And he's like, yeah, of course I can help you. Let me just finish these emails real quick. So I'll sit and I'll wait for the emails to finish. He gets those done. It's like, all right, let's go. We start moving out of the office, and then he's got to stop and talk to Teresa. I'm like, okay, I'll wait. He finally finishes there. And then we get out the front door. We start walking across the lawn. And he's like, oh, hold on a second. I forgot my wallet in the car. Okay. He goes to the car, gets the wallet. We get inside the building, and he's like, oh, man, I forgot to call the bug people. Hold on a second. So I wait. And then we finally get in the building, and we're getting the ladder, and his phone rings, and it's his wife. He answers it and walks away. And I'm like, dude, I just want to move the ladder. Like, come on. Now, this is just for moving a ladder, right? This is just something simple. I can't imagine how I would be if this was for something as serious as one of my children's health and he was the doctor, right? Yet this is Jesus. This is Jesus in this moment, making time in this moment, even when it seems so inappropriate. See, here's the thing. Literally everyone in this crowd had been touching Jesus. They were all pressed up against him while traveling to Jairus' house. But only one person had been healed. Now imagine, this woman knows full well that Jesus is talking about her. Right? She's done everything she can to keep anonymity. And she's terrified that maybe she could make Jesus unclean. Because that's the way uncleanness works. An unclean person touches somebody who's not unclean, and now they're both unclean, right? She's terrified that maybe she could have made others unclean. Her goal was to get healed and then slink away without anyone knowing that she had ever been there in the first place. But then Jesus begins calling out. This reminds me of back in the day when we had just one family computer and it ran on dial-up, right? The good old days. And I've always loved technology. And I've loved to mess with things and try to learn them. And the problem is that my dad loves for his computer to work. And so I would sneak into my parents' bedroom, I'd get on the computer, and I'd do some things to make the computer better. And then, I'd finish up there, I'd head back to my room, and I'm just doing whatever I'm doing until suddenly I hear booming from down the hallway, "Who touched my computer?" The panic. Right? The fear. I mean, he knew it was me, right? Do I have to say anything? Right? Do I play dumb? What could possibly have happened to the computer anyway? How does he know? Right? And so if I'm asking these questions, I'm like, what questions must have been racing through this woman's mind as Jesus cries out, "Who touched me?" And so take a look, Mark 5:33. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. We don't deal with purity laws like they did. So I really do think that we'll struggle to capture the weight of this. But this is unacceptable behavior. Like, this is not okay. This is maybe along the lines of sneezing in somebody else's face, right? We just know you don't do that unless you're my kids. But otherwise, you don't do that, right? Unacceptable. The people would have been furious with her. She put them all in danger. This is why she's so fearful. I mean, as she falls at the feet of Jesus, it says she was trembling with fear. She's been healed, and yet all she has is fear. Because what are the crowds going to do to her? Right? Are they going to start picking up stones and try to kill her for putting them all at risk? So how does Jesus respond? Verse 34, and he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Now, at first glance, this is just Jesus addressing her and sending her off. But church, there's so much more going on here than just that. Do you know what Jesus does not call anyone else in the entirety of the gospel accounts? Daughter. Daughter. No one else is called daughter. There's a reason that Jesus takes a moment to call this woman out. This woman who has been an outcast for 12 years. This woman who has not felt touch for 12 years. This woman who has lived feeling disgusted by her own body for 12 years. This woman who hasn't been able to experience God for 12 years. In this moment, the crowds filled with rage because what if she touched me? She came from this way. Maybe I'm unclean now. And Jesus, for her sake, but also for the sake of everyone else there to hear, calls this woman daughter. I want you to consider the weight of this. Imagine the weight of 12 long years of suffering. And now waiting to hear your condemnation come from the mouth of Jesus, just to hear him call you daughter. Imagine the weight of the stone that you're lifting as you're in the crowd, filled with rage. Imagine what happens to the weight of that stone as your rage is addressed by Jesus saying, no. This one's mine. This one belongs to me. Why did Jesus slow down and make a scene out of this? Because Jesus moved at a pace that allowed him to make time for love. What was it that this woman really hadn't felt for 12 years? It was love. And these crowds are following Jesus, excited to see what he does next. And that suddenly turns into rage and disgust for this woman. And Jesus quickly acts as the parent and makes clear that just as Jairus rushes to save his little girl, Jesus is rushing to the rescue of his own little girl right here and now. That's our Jesus. He makes clear that if anyone wants to take issue with this woman, they're going to have to go through Jesus. Church, if you really considered the extreme efforts that Jesus constantly goes through to show you just how much you're loved, just how passionate he is about you. I think that sometimes we get this idea that Jesus is so overwhelmed with worrying about all the other problems in the world that there's no way he has time for what's going on in my life. And this story, this moment of Jesus locking eyes with this unnamed woman and calling her daughter, is a reminder that Jesus has all the time in the world for you. He has the time to stop and ask who touched him when it comes to his children. And as we live out the Christian life, I think we need to be reminded of this moment. We need to be reminded of what Jesus has done. And we need to be reminded that if we are going to love people the way that he loves us, we probably have a lot of work to do. The story got me thinking hard about how many people I've seen in life who needed help and I simply moved on. Right? And while I moved on, Jesus was moved with compassion. And I want so badly for Jesus to fill me and all of his people with the compassion that he has for humanity. Imagine if we looked at people the same way Jesus looks at people. But hold on a moment. All of this is moving and important. But Jairus, his daughter, right? Mark 5:35. While Jesus was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, "Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" You know, Jairus had come to Jesus full of panic. Jesus has been walking alongside Jairus in that panic, and that panic has spiked as Jesus slowed down for this woman. And while millions of thoughts and fears are swirling through Jairus' mind, and he is internally pleading with Jesus to hurry up and move on to his daughter next, someone speaks up while Jesus is still talking and addressing the woman. "Your daughter's dead, Jairus." As Jesus calls this woman daughter, Jairus' own daughter has now passed. The despair. Right? We all know parents aren't supposed to have to bury their children. And now Jairus' panic is swirling in the ugliest way with despair. The people tell him not to bother the teacher anymore. But hold on, the teacher. Is that all he is? Why did Jairus come to Jesus at all if all he is a teacher? Why did Jairus believe that a touch could heal his daughter if all he is a teacher? Verse 36, it says, "But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.' And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, 'Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child's not dead, but sleeping.' And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was." Every moment of this story, Jesus has been surrounded by the crowds. He has the crowd of his own apostles. The crowds of the people excited to see the miracle. And now there's the crowds of these people at Jairus' house. These crowds were there before Jesus got on the boat and went across the lake. As soon as he came back, the crowds were there again. The crowds have been there this whole time. And the moment that Jesus heard that Jairus' daughter was dead, he sent away the crowds. He gets to the house, and there are crowds there wailing and crying, and Jesus sends them away. He sent away his own crowd, keeping only 3 with him. And Jesus enters into the room with just mom, dad, and a few disciples. This again is about the pace at which Jesus lives and does ministry. The crowds were here to see a miracle, and here's an opportunity for the biggest one yet, and Jesus sends them away. Because Jesus made time for family. It's not about the fanfare. It's not about everyone seeing this and getting excited. But this is about an opportunity for Jesus to personally love this family and be with them in this moment that is certainly the most important moment of their lives to this point. Verse 41. Taking her by the hand, this little girl, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. You know, I think a lot of times that when we think about Jesus, we think of him as this big, powerful man barking orders because he's God, right? But knowing about the way that Jesus did ministry and knowing the pace at which he lived his life, I think it's incredibly likely that Jesus got on his knees next to this little girl so that his mouth was right next to her ear, just like her daddy might do. He said, hey, it's time to get up, little girl. There's a whole bunch of life left for you to live. Why don't you get on up? Right? Now, why would I think that? Just look at how Jesus was with the last woman he encountered, calling her daughter in the midst of the crowd. This is the wild thing, church. If anybody knows anything about family, it's Jesus, a single man who lived and died that way. This man knows family. And that man makes time for family. His pace allowed for grace to this family. His pace teaches us to make time for family. Maybe it's your immediate family, maybe it's your church family. Right? This is one of the reasons that we've been encouraging you to sign up for Continue the Conversation. Right? Listen, church, there are a lot of things that you can do alone. Christianity's not one of them. We want to encourage you to slow down and take some time to learn and to love with your church family. Jesus is calling us to slow down and learn how to love people well. He's calling us to slow down and to love our families well. And I love this tiny detail. He tells them to make sure they get her some food to eat. Like, this is Jesus we're talking about, right? This girl was dead. Jesus made her not dead. Jesus could have made her not hungry, right? In fact, there are a couple stories where he does that kind of stuff. But this time, he tells them to get her some food. You know how families can love each other well? Get some food. Right? Now listen, it's Sunday. I know how this works. Y'all are thinking about food anyway, right? You're thinking about where you're going to go to lunch after this. I know how this works. Since you're thinking about it anyway, we challenge you. Don't just think about where you're going to go for lunch. Think about who you're going to take to lunch with you. Right? Who can you invest in? If being hurried is squeezing God out of your life, then how can you take a moment of just needing to survive by throwing some food in your mouth and turn that into a moment where you slow down? Say, how can I invest in somebody? How can I show the love of Jesus to somebody? Busyness is external. We're all busy. But imagine what life would be like if we could all learn to ruthlessly eliminate hurry from our lives. What if we could see the amount of grace that Jesus had because of the pace at which he lived his life? Imagine what the world would think if they saw a church that lived at the pace of grace. Church, it was Jesus' pace that allowed him to work his way to the cross. It was his pace that allowed him the time to sit and sweat great drops of blood in the garden. It was his pace that led him through every single moment that he went to the cross and beyond to lead to reconciling a relationship with you. The gospel itself hinges on the fact that Jesus lives his life at the pace of grace. And listen, I know that there are some of you here today who maybe have never had this sort of relationship with Jesus. You've never had the moment where Jesus calls you daughter, or where Jesus calls you son. That's your first step today. Jesus is so passionately in love with you. He wants to have a relationship with you. And Romans 10 tells us it's as simple as you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and you will be saved. Right? And so if that's you today, that's your step. That's your only step, is allow the pace of Jesus to work his way into your life. And for the rest of us, I have 3 takeaways for us. Number 1, in your busyness, ask, where is God? Right? We're all busy. We're all busy. As you're busy, make sure that it doesn't turn into hurry and ask, where is God in this? As you're rushing to the store, as you're rushing through work, as you're rushing to take your kids to games and everything else that's happening in life, just ask, where is God in this? Number 2, move a little slower this week. You know why God instituted the Sabbath? It's a moment for us to rebel against hustle culture. And I say, no, God's got me. He's got this under control. I can move a little slower because I know that my well-being, your well-being, the well-being of the universe doesn't lie in my ability to hustle. It lies in Jesus. And number 3, don't be afraid. Just believe. This is what Jesus said to Jairus. And as we encounter this life, as we try to follow Jesus, I don't know about you guys, but I have found that it's intimidating, right? There are so many times I'm like, yeah, Jesus, that sounds great, but... And he says back, don't be afraid, just believe. Just believe. You can trust me, Seth. You can trust me, South Valley. I want to give you this opportunity to just consider the things in your life as we come to the close of this year. As we move into the new year, lots of New Year's resolutions, whether you're a person who does those or not, and just consider, how can your life in 2024 be more intentional about Jesus than 2023 was?